Yeah, northwest slope of Big Ridge State Park is where the fort was. Well, they were already established there, and according to historians that have researched this, they have pretty well decided that Nicholas Gibbs was at Sharp's Fort. Well, when was he there? Well, it had to be from the time he sold out till he bought the property here. More than likely, he spent the winter with his two daughters and then moved here. Of course, one of those daughters married Conrad Sharp, and the other one married John Stotterly. And that's, of course, the many that are here today came down through those two daughters. I might also mention, since we're talking about early history here, we've got Paul Reynolds and Kilmer here, who are descendants from James Reynolds, who had the fort at the crossroads. Now, the fort was already established before Nicholas Gibbs built his home here, we think, probably about 1787, which was 2 years after the North Carolina legislature had put aside, well, I don't even call it money. They didn't have that much money then. But they decided to build a road from Washington to Niceboro. Of course, that's Niceville. And part of it came through here, known as the Cumberland Road. And later, part of it became known as Emory Road. But it still was part of the original Cumberland Road that came by here. Also, it's said that Andrew Jackson traveled this road when he went to his inauguration. Don't know that for sure, but that's what's been handed down over the years. And we also know that at Reynolds Fort, that was here. Now, that was one of the reasons, of course, Nicholas Gibbs built his home here. They would build their homes as close as they could to the place where they could gather when the Indians were on the uprising. Now, we won't get into the Reynolds Fort, but it was built by James Reynolds. And the point I'm trying to make is, did any of you ever hear, or have you ever heard of Sam Houston? Did I cover Sam Houston last year or something? You don't know, do you? So this is all new to everyone. But now Sam Houston, who was he governor of Tennessee one time? You don't know that? Okay, he was governor of Tennessee, and why is he so famous? Well, have you ever been to Texas or heard of Houston, Texas, or heard of the first president of the Republic of Texas? Well, that was Sam Houston. And guess where Sam Houston spent time? Right here. In 1810, his father, 1808, 1810, right in that general area, his, I'm reading all my notes here, I'm not using anyway. His father sent Sam here to go to school at Professor Isaac Anderson's log schoolhouse down on Murphy Road, about 3 or 4 or 5 miles down Tasley Pike. And no doubt, I would think, with people being as scarce as they were then, don't you imagine that Sam Houston spent time here with the Gibbs family? It just makes sense to me that he would do that out visiting. So you never know in any community who has been by, who has passed by. And so many times the stories get twisted and the truth's not told, but we know that Sam Houston was a part of this community just for a few years when he was a small boy. Now, I'll throw the floor open for questions. If any of you have questions about the house, and if we can't give you the right answer, Becky was nice and said she'd make up a story. Well, I'll just flat out lie. So, do any of you, is there anything you want to know that someone here can answer? Now, you're talking about George Mann. Well, George Mann lived, all right, then we're going to have to go back to Reynolds Fort and start there. James Reynolds built the fort 1787, and his son, Robert Reynolds, if I'm getting all these names correct, if I'm not, Kilmer, you can help me out here, moved here with his father, or at his father's fort in 1800, owned property on Tasley Pike going back this way, and stayed there a while, but in 1794, he rented his place to a Revolutionary War veteran named George Mann. Well, George Mann moved in with his family, and it's an interesting thing because he went through the Revolutionary War probably without a scratch, but he was out feeding his horses late one evening, and Indians attacked him. And where his home was located, of course, now he was a tenant farmer, and he had rented the place from Robert Reynolds, the son of James Reynolds, who built the fort. And anyway, Indians attacked and shot him, and there is a cave called Campbell's Cave that was right next to his house. And he jumped down in the cave and went through the cave, and it had another exit or entrance, whichever way you wanted to go, on the other end about, maybe a quarter of a mile. I don't think it's much more than that. And he went out that exit. Well, the question might be raised, why didn't he stay and fight the Indians with his wife and his children inside that house? But you see, he did that to try to get them, to lure them away from his family. He went into that cave. The Indians were pretty smart. They were here a long time before any of us could claim this area, and they knew where the exit was to that cave, and guess what? They were waiting for George Mann. Pulled him out of the cave, strung him up, scalped him, mutilated his body, cut it all to pieces, and when Nicholas Gibbs and the other, no doubt the Reynolds family and anyone else that was around here, when they found out about it and went where George Mann was, of course he was dead, and they had burned his body. There wasn't much left. So he was, now this is a long story, Lisa, you shouldn't have gotten me started on this. So anyway, they buried what was left of George Mann, and he was the last man in Knox County, in this county, around in this area, that was killed by Indians. Well, that's not the end of the story, because they went back, they set fire to all of his outbuildings, and they tried to enter the log house where his wife and children were. And luckily for his wife, Mr. Mann had just taught her just a few days before how to handle the rifle, how to set it, and how to shoot it. And one of them, Price, opened the door, and she fired the rifle, and it went through one Indian, killing him and wounded another one. So they apparently, if I can tie this together, took the wounded and left. And of course, Mrs. Mann didn't know what had happened to her husband, and they stayed in that house till morning, until on up in the night. And then the story goes that she traveled all the way from where their home was, which would be what, Joe, about 3 miles, 2.5, 3 miles, walking back down to the Reynolds fort, calling out her husband's name, didn't know that he was already dead. Well, that always intrigued me, something like that, and a few years ago I decided that it was time to find the grave of George Mann, and I'd always heard it was in the woods behind where he had lived, and I got with a gentleman that knew where he was, and we went back through the woods, and like I never found it. In fact, I tripped over the fieldstone that was supposed to be his grave. So we decided that would be good for the Heartland series. Those of you that most of you familiar with that, with Bill Landry. So we got Bill Landry, a bunch of men in the community, and we decided we'd go go to George Mann's grave, and we'd do this story on it. Well, that's what we did, and showed him where the grave was. Then we went to another lady, Barbara Walker. Barbara's not here, is she? You can tell this better than I could, but anyway, and she told Bill Landry, said, that's not where he's buried. Said, there's an Indian buried there. So I happened to hear that, and I go running up there because he made a liar out of me. Now this goes to prove how history can get twisted around everyone. So you've got to be careful in what you hear and what you believe. That can be proven. And come to find out that what was left of George Mann was buried in front of that cave where they found him. And the grave that for years that everyone in this community thought was the grave of George Mann was actually one of the Indians that killed him. That's an interesting story. Is that the end of it? No, that's still not the end of it. 1959, Barbara Walker and her grandmother were sitting out on the front porch one Sunday afternoon.